Thank you very much, and I apologize for changing the title. I kind of like this title because I think statistics makes all of our heads spin, and I hear that a lot from the students that I work with and from the journalists that I work with. At the same time, a lot of us feel that with statistics we can spin news. And so what I wanted to do was kind of give you a bit of a broad overview of what I do, but also give you a little sense of some of the ideas behind it in statistics and in journalism and sort of how we get to what we do. And hopefully you'll find some of this kind of amusing, because I think all of us read the news and sometimes wonder, how should we figure out whether this means anything for my life or not? A little bit of a few words about myself. I kind of grew up in the ivory tower, so to speak. I went to graduate school thinking I was going to be a pure mathematician in the traditional sense, and that's what I did for many years. Arrived at George Mason and got tenure for my work in symplectic geometry, and I continue that work, and I think that mathematics is really, really beautiful. But when you're in the ivory tower, you really don't have much influence on Main Street, and I think that that was how I got really interested in how the discourse about mathematics and statistics and science kind of plays out in the public forum. So I joined up with this organization called Stats. Right as Stats was joining George Mason, it was an independent nonprofit and then became affiliated with the university. And that's when I joined as a director of research. I have a fabulous editor there named Trevor Butterworth. And I like to say that the way we work together is he knows how to smell a rat and I know how to dissect a rat. So that's how we kind of started with this work. But sometimes what we do is a little bit of gotcha work, sort of pointing out when the media gets it wrong. But I like to emphasize, and sort of the motion of the organization since I've joined it has really taken on some role of trying to really be there for journalists, because I think part of what happens is they're on such tight deadlines with such small budgets, and it's very difficult to get accurate quantitative analysis in there, especially if you're the science editor and in fact your degree is not in science, which is what happens a lot in journalism these days. So where does statistics come up in the news? And I think most of you would say pretty much everywhere, but just to highlight some of these places, maybe I'll move over to this microphone as well. Am I coming out okay? Okay. So economics and money, of course, is a clear place. Crime, social behavior, this is kind of a more interesting one, but you see a lot of these kinds of studies. What happens if you put children in daycare? Is that good for them? Is that bad for them? What about people going to college? Are they having sex too early? Are they drinking too much? Are people doing more drugs or less drugs? Are they smoking more? Are they smoking less? These kinds of things. The budget, of course, which is under a lot of discussion now. And when you talk about the budget, one of the things that we see a lot is sort of an inability to understand orders of magnitude. So the difference between billions and trillions of dollars. Sports, polls and opinion. I'm going to talk a little bit about polls and opinion today. That was very interesting with the election 2 months ago. And public health and healthcare is also something that we spend a tremendous amount of time thinking about, and I'll talk about quite a lot today. And then, of course, education, which is probably my favorite topic, and I will also give you some very nice examples here. So let me start out with a very general thing, and then I'm going to jump into more specific examples of kind of common misunderstandings that come up in the press. So the first is, what is the meaning of statistically significant? And just as a kind of a very vague description of what statistically significant means, is that whenever you run let's suppose you run some study and you're trying to figure out whether a drug works or not, you need to figure out a way of saying, well, did it just work by accident or did it actually work? And so there's some standard agreements, let's say, in the community of what it means to judge whether it's possible that it just worked because you got lucky, or whether it in fact would really work in the whole population. And to give a better sense of what that means, well, actually, let me save that. I think we'll come back to that. Causation versus correlation, this is another big one. If you see something like teenage girls who do yoga are less likely to have eating disorders. That's a very interesting statement. Does that mean that there is a correlation, which is to say that maybe people who have a better body image are more likely to do yoga? Or is it that there's some causal thing that actually doing yoga will improve your body image? So that's a very common misunderstanding in the press. Relative risk versus absolute risk. My favorite example of the difference between this is that if I walk to work versus if I drive to work, the chance that a piano falls on my head, how would I describe that? Well, the absolute risk for this is extremely low, right? How likely is it I'd walk to work and somebody would drop a piano out of their window? But the relative risk compared to somebody who drives is quite high, okay? So relative risk is comparing two groups of people. Absolute risk is what is my risk of doing something. And again, that can be very confused, and it's an important one. If someone says that some behavior increases your chance of cancer by 300%, that's scary. But if your chance of cancer is very, very small, it's less scary. So these are really two very important and very different concepts. Odds ratio versus relative risk, I won't spend too much time about that. Confounding factors, this is a really important one, which again I'll get back to later in the talk with some examples, but it's when you try to measure something statistically and you forget there's some factor that could really have influenced those results, and if you measured it, maybe you'd really see that influence. Scales and orders of magnitude, that's something I mentioned earlier, and again I'll give an example in which these orders of magnitude are really not explained. Margin of error, this is a fabulous one that comes up quite a lot in talking about polls, for example. And again, I think I'll have some time to talk more about margin of error later in the talk. Consensus of scientists versus individual research results. This is probably my own personal pet peeve about how a lot of health results are presented in the press. Somebody does a research study, and then a press release is presented to the public, and then journalists report on the press release, and we all get the information that, for example, caffeine intake will increase miscarriage rates. But it's not put in the context of the many years of research that has been done on that topic. So the new study becomes the study that describes everything, and the consensus of scientific information about something is quite ignored. And this is really, really important when trying to understand toxins in our environment. For example, there may be hundreds of studies about a topic. One scientist might get a lot of attention, and if that scientist is very loud, then they'll get more attention than might be merited by the research alone. So that's kind of a sort of beginning point of the common things that I've seen, but let me give you some examples. So I'm going to read through rather quickly this particular one because there's going to be a lot of text, because I want to quote for you some of the things that we actually read in the article. This is a probe that looked at drinking water, and it was an article on how bad our drinking water is. And it talked about the pharmaceuticals that we can find in them, and these are all quotes from it. A vast array of pharmaceuticals, including antibiotics, anticonvulsants, mood stabilizers, and sex hormones, have been found in the drinking water supplies of at least 41 million Americans, an Associated Press investigation shows. Officials in Philadelphia said testing there discovered 56 pharmaceuticals or byproducts in treated drinking water, including medicines for pain, infection, high cholesterol, asthma, epilepsy, mental illness, and heart problems. 63 pharmaceuticals or byproducts were found in the city's watersheds. I think I'll have another sip of my Deer Park water. Anti-epileptic and anti-anxiety medications were detected in a portion of the treated drinking water for 18.5 million people in Southern California. Researchers at the U.S. Geological Survey analyzed a Passaic Valley Water Commission drinking water treatment plant, which serves 850,000 people in northern New Jersey, and found a metabolized angina medicine and the mood-stabilizing carbamazepine in drinking water. 3 medications, including an antibiotic, were found in drinking water supplies to Tucson, Arizona. Sex hormone was detected in San Francisco's drinking water. And now for our own area, the drinking water for Washington, D.C. and surrounding areas tested positive for 6 pharmaceuticals. So there the message is really clear. You should be worried. Your drinking water is contaminated. But let's talk about what wasn't said. And I think this is really important. It's very hard kind of to come up with these questions of what wasn't said, and certainly journalists aren't always doing it. What's the order of magnitude? So they pointed out that the drugs were found in concentrations from parts per billion to parts per trillion, which is sort of like saying that something costs between $1,000 and $1 million. So we've got just huge ranges that we're talking about in a little innocent statement like the concentration ranged from parts per billion to parts per trillion, which sounds like a lot. There's no discussion of what effect these pharmaceuticals could have in minute quantities. This is really important. How worried should we be that we see these things in drinking water? You know, there's arsenic in carrots. How many of you knew that, right? But it's not likely to be dangerous for you in the quantities that you normally eat of carrots. And that's a really important thing. It's one of the basic tenets of toxicology, that the dose makes the poison. There's no comparisons, okay? So we've seen pharmaceuticals. What about oil or gasoline or other kinds of contaminants? How does that compare? And, you know, it's treated sewage. What else is in there? As kind of, you know, I think that's really important to think. There's a lot of things that go in our water if we want to measure minute quantities. Now, this isn't to say that we shouldn't be worried about it. It's to say that the author of the AP Probe article didn't take into consideration a really important task of giving the reader a perspective of what this means. So the message is, get worried, this is terrible, drugs are bad. And I think, unfortunately, they're not really giving us a sense of how worried we should be, how bad is it. It's kind of a scare article. So I would say that as this job kind of got on, there were times where things got very personal. And I have 4 kids, and 2 of them are still really small and were born while I was doing this work. And when one of them was quite young, the New York Times came out with an article about breastfeeding. And of course, it gets very personal. These are very personal decisions. I was nursing my kid, in fact, but I felt that the benefits to breastfeeding were a little bit overstated in the media. And I want to give you, first show you a little video that was not made by New York Times. I'm going to get to New York Times coverage in a moment, but was actually made by the Department of Health and Human Services about nursing. So let's see if this will.
Studies show babies who are breastfed are less likely to develop ear infections, respiratory illnesses, and diarrhea. Babies were born to be breastfed.
Okay, so that was a pretty shocking video. In fact, there was so much outrage over it, they did eventually take it down. But you know, the words of the statement was that studies show that breastfeeding will reduce the risk of ear infection and diarrhea, which is actually pretty well established scientifically. But the image, of course, was a little bit more shocking and really suggested that you're taking quite a big risk, sort of like riding a mechanical bull, to not breastfeed. So the question became, is it dangerous to use infant formula? This is me and my 4th son, who's now 20 months, very cute. Is it dangerous to use infant formula? And so New York Times came up with an article that was titled Breastfeed or Else, and had a teaser that read, warning, public health officials have determined that not breastfeeding may be hazardous to your baby's health. So pretty shocking. The lead scientist was quoted, the lead scientist on the study that they reported on, just like it's risky to smoke during pregnancy, it's risky not to breastfeed after. So the comparison there is a pretty stark comparison, like smoking during pregnancy. And for those of you who don't know, smoking during pregnancy, among many things that it's bad for, also leads to premature birth. So it has very serious consequences. They claim that it reduces the risk for ear infections and flu, which is actually fairly uncontroversial. That is true. Also for obesity, diabetes, sudden infant death syndrome, asthma, and leukemia. And all of those are actually quite controversial within the scientific community. And the article also noted that IQ rates increase with nursing. That turned out to be simply false. So the IQ one is kind of an interesting case of confounding factors. They measured IQ of women who nursed and IQ of women who didn't nurse. They measured the IQ of the children, and they forgot to take into account the mother's IQ. And when they adjusted for the mother's IQ, they found that it actually did not influence IQ rates. And this is really important because one of the facts demographically about nursing is that poorer women and less educated women are less likely to nurse. So there are a lot of things that can be conflated here when you have other social factors that influence why someone makes a decision that they do. So it turns out, in fact, smoking is much more dangerous than not nursing. One of the things that we found was that the studies on nursing are actually really poorly done, and part of that is because it's very difficult to do that kind of study. There's no way you could do a randomized controlled trial. That's kind of the gold standard, the golden standard to do it, to compare groups where you assign one group to nurse and one group not to nurse and then see what happens. People like to make their own decisions, and they make those decisions for a variety of reasons. So it's very difficult to evaluate it when there's so many influences. There's a lot of studies didn't control for confounding factors. For example, the increase in asthma turned out could be largely attributed to the fact that the parents smoked. Back when they first did some studies on nursing, or some of the earlier studies that are now considered old, say from the 80s, actually didn't think about whether parents who smoked in the home could influence the children's health. And those same parents were more likely to use formula. So again, it's very difficult to know what to attribute a health consequence to. Demographics are really important in this. A lot of the studies that are used to justify the recommendation that women nurse absolutely is based on research in third world countries where water quality is really different, healthcare is really different, and these are important issues. If you have bad water, you can have many more digestive and diarrhea problems with the babies, and they do die, and it's very sad. But this is not typically what happens in a first world country. So it's a really important question when you ask whether you want to tell women that they might kill their children by giving them formula. Another question is, what's the magnitude of the benefit? And I actually spent quite some time trying to really assess, if you take the studies on nursing at face value and you don't question how the research results were come to, but just take it at face value, if you look at the most aggressive assessments of the leukemia risk due to not nursing, you find that risk is about the same or a little bit less than the risk of driving with an infant in the car with a car seat properly restrained. So this kind of comparison, I just want to give this to you. You walk into a pediatrician's office with a young child and they will tell you, you absolutely need to nurse your child for the first year of their life. This is really, really important. They tell you, you could get leukemia and it could die if you don't. But I've never walked into a pediatrician's office where they say, do not get into a car for the next year. I don't care how carefully you restrain your car, you could get in a car accident and your child could die. Now these are true statements, again, taking the research at face value about leukemia. And they're difficult, perhaps, to adjust your life to not being in a car, right? And so, in fact, nobody tells you that. Sometimes, for some women, it's very difficult to nurse as opposed to use formula. And I think that in a personal way, I felt, look, the amount of risk to a child driving in a car in an appropriate car seat for their age, properly restrained during the first year of their life, is a risk most of us take. And it's a little bit unfair to put nursing in that same to be told not to use formula if that's the level of risk. And I just kind of wanted to give you a sense, again, of the magnitude of the problem. And again, what's the human side? A lot of women felt really awful about the New York Times coverage. And that's because why it is that women nurse or don't nurse is extremely personal. It could be related to their job, it could be related to their emotional state, with regard to their connection to the child. It could be for health consequences. But for sure, this kind of coverage makes those women feel just like they're the worst mothers in the whole world. And it's just, I think, it has very bad consequences. And I have a lot more to say about nursing. If anyone wants to get me afterwards, I can't stop talking about it. But it's one of these things. By the way, after writing the work that I did, in which I made so many of the points that I just made to you, I got quite a lot of hate mail, just to say how much people really, really are personally invested in that question, and how much, and anyone who says that the benefits are a little bit overstated is clearly not a good parent. So I just want to give you a sense of how much people are quite attached, from nurses even. Okay, so the question then that brings us to is, are there politics in science? I think that's kind of an obvious question that comes out of some of the things that I just mentioned to you of examples. Does it make any sense to say we're looking for truth? If the statistics can be played one way, they can be played another way. Is science really a pure thing? I think these are sort of very deep philosophical questions that you encounter very quickly in doing this kind of work. Does morality or conviction drive our research? That was the one thing that I felt with nursing was really clear, that people had a very strong conviction about nursing, but we see this all the time in many, many other instances. If we have one of our fellows at Stats does a lot of work on drug use and abuse, and she finds that the reaction of so many people who are just horrified that there are drug abusers in the world, and who have a real moral outrage about it, are willing to come to conclusions that really stem from this kind of judgment that's going on, and it makes it very difficult to do it. Whose voice is loudest? I mentioned this earlier. When some people get their opinions in the press and other people don't. Where does funding come from? That's a big one, of course. People are very suspicious of anything funded by industry. I personally think they should also be suspicious of organizations that fund things out of any ideological framework. So a lot of times we see studies about pollution that are put out by environmental organizations that sometimes their scientific content is not all that different than in fact what scientists have been saying for many years. The interpretation is very different. And I'm not sure, I mean, when you ask, would you trust a scientist about the scientific results, or would you trust an environmentalist about the scientific results? A scientist is invested in the science. An environmentalist is invested in keeping, in the environment. So there are different perspectives as to how they're going to interpret the same work. I wanted to show you another movie that claimed that hot dogs cause cancer. And this was a movie trying to encourage political action, and it was put out by the Physicians for Responsible Medicine.
I thought I'd live forever. I was dumbfounded when the doctor told me I have late-stage colon cancer.
Deciding between surgery and radiation wasn't easy. Who knows what sort of side effects I'll have? It's been really tough on my husband, my kids, and me. Cancer affects the whole family.
Cancer risk starts early. Even small amounts of processed meats can lead to adult cancers.
So again, a rather shocking video to have children talking about their lives being ruined by cancer because they're eating hot dogs at school. And I'm not going to really address the issue of how children felt watching that video, but I did want to talk about CNN's coverage of the video and the claim. So it's the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. The CNN pointed out that this group is an animal rights group who wants us all to be vegans. Okay, so that's actually, I mean, it's kind of a fair statement about this organization, and I think they do a lot of really interesting work at what the impacts are of animal products. But what I want to emphasize here is not really to criticize the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine at this particular moment, but rather to criticize CNN's coverage of it. Because what CNN did was affirm the link between processed meats, nitrates in particular, and cancer. And they cited two organizations, American Institute for Cancer Research and American Cancer Society. And it makes it very convincing as a kind of naive viewer who's not somebody who studies cancer, that in fact there's a really clear link. And then they make the claim even that a hot dog a day causes an increase by 21% in cancer. I'm not sure what exactly they mean over lifetime, or like, you know, every hot dog every day. I mean, a hot dog every single day, or what exactly they mean by this, but it's a pretty surprising statement, and cancer sort of the most generic form. But then we looked at what did CNN not say. So the American Medical Association did an entire literature review on the link between nitrates in particular, which is what is of concern in processed meats, and cancer. And they came out with a statement saying that epidemiological studies cannot confirm any association between the presence of nitrites or nitrates in food and the formation of NOCs and the causation of human cancer. So I'm not trying to stand on one side of this issue as much to point out that it's a little bit unrealistic for CNN to do a center story on an organization that's considered somewhat fringe and not talk about what the American Medical Association is saying about this topic, especially if they did an entire literature review. They're not just commenting on it, okay? The AMA also published a letter in the New York Times dismissing that organization and saying that their tactics were unethical. That was actually based on previous things that they had done. This got cut off. But the cancer link hasn't been shown to be statistically significant, and it's actually clouded by recall bias that didn't show up on the slide. So the point is that recall bias is really important in cancer research because people who get cancer actually will invent exposure. They will overestimate the previous exposure, and they will say, oh yeah, I ate a hot dog every day. So it's an important thing to ask whether there's bias in how people are responding if you're going to try to do some kind of retrospective study. So, so when we ask about are there politics in science, you might start to say, after you do this work long enough, is there any science in politics? And my answer is a kind of knee-jerk reaction is very little. But I want to kind of tell you a little bit about some statistics first before I kind of get into that. And I'm going to bring up something extremely political after this. So this picture here is what we call the normal curve. And the idea of this is that a lot of things like a lot of behaviors in the world that are statistical actually have the behavior of the normal curve in the following sense. This symbol mu here that's the average. So when you say the average income is such and such, or the average IQ is such and such, what you're talking about is this middle point. So let's use the example of IQ. If we did an IQ test of everyone let's say in the United States, we would have an average that comes right here. And then if we start saying, well, let's suppose on the x-axis, let's suppose that we start asking, well, how on the x-axis we put the IQ level, so this is just the average IQ, and on the y-axis we put how many people had that IQ. So we start piling it in, and most people, if you see the highest point is at the peak where mu is. That's where the high point of the little mountain is, and that's to say that most people have IQs that are at the average, and they kind of cluster around the average. And these percentages here are telling you what percent of the people are in that distance from the average. So, for example, if you say, well, how many people have IQ between this value and this value, you would say, well, it's 34.1% plus 34.1%. And that sigma value, this sigma is the distance between mu and mu minus sigma, and also between mu and mu plus sigma. That sigma is what's called a standard deviation. So if we say that everyone, we say what percentage of people have IQ within one standard deviation of the mean, the answer would be, on a normal curve, would be 68.2%. So the idea of a normal curve is that most of the time, when you sample somebody, they end up in this blue region. And if you want to get really most everyone, 95.4%, they would end up with an IQ between here and here. And then there's a very small number of people who will have IQs way out there or way out here. Okay, so that's the idea of a normal curve. And I wanted to bring this up because this concept of a normal curve is something that's really quite ubiquitous within statistics and in thinking about it, and it's something that comes up many, 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 many times. And if you understand this curve, you can really frame a lot of the questions about statistics in terms of this curve and understand what it is that people are talking about. So now I want to talk about something very, very political, and the role of science in the political discussion. This has to do with the deaths from the Iraqi war. So some of you know that a few years ago, Lancet did some reports on the number of people, Iraqi people, who were killed after the US invasion. And I actually want to talk not about the most recent reports, but actually about one that was published in 2004 about deaths that occurred between 2003 and 2004. And the Lancet came out with a report that was considered quite controversial within media circles, that approximately 98,000 excess deaths, so that's compared to how many would have died had there not been a war, and was 98,000. And they said that there was an error margin, and the true value could be expected to be between 8,000 and 196,000. Now, what did the media take from this? And I really want to kind of point out this. So a lot of people were very political about how they responded to it. People who are opposed to the war spent a lot of time talking about how awful this was and how correct these predictions were. People who felt pro-war were very suspicious of these numbers and felt that there were all sorts of problems in the statistical methods. All of a sudden, conservative pundits became experts in statistics and were able to dismiss these studies. And it was great. So I don't want to go into like all the details about this, but what I do want to say is that the press reported it was just as likely as to be 8,000 as to be 98,000. And this is really an incorrect statement. And let me put up there that normal curve again to give you a sense of how improbable that is. So a normal curve is also really good for sampling. And the idea is that if we sample something and we get 98,000, what we're saying is that is the most likely value. It is much less likely that the number is going to be 8,000 than it is going to be 98,000. If you believe the methods of the study, which again, like I'm saying, there were considerations about that, but this kind of comment that it's just as likely is a gross misunderstanding of what statistics mean when we do a sample and we do a measurement. So Bush called the methods controversial, and I would say that they're fairly standard methods in epidemiology. There are some reasons to believe that the methods were controversial. In particular, the authors of the study were very overtly anti-war. That did not help their situation in terms of people's suspicion about their methods. And if you really look at their methods carefully, there are some issues to go into, which I won't here, but I do want to point out that the idea that it was controversial in a superficial way, which I think is what Bush is saying, was really not a fair assessment from a scientific point of view. So let me bring up a few other political actions that were based on science. One is a move that's gone on, it's gotten quite a lot of attention recently, to ban a class of chemicals called phthalates from toys. Phthalates have been considered quite a lot in scientific studies. They are these chemicals that are found in plastics that make them kind of malleable. They're also in cosmetics. They help smells stay on you longer. And there has been some concern that they can cause problems. I actually have done this talk in which I've gone into great lengths about some of the coverage about it, because there have been a lot of media claims that they cause genital defects when in fact there's no evidence of that at all. But there is some evidence that they could cause some harm. However, most of our exposure to phthalates, if you look at the NIH reviews of the toxicologists who have done scientific panels on phthalates, turns out that most of our exposure comes through food and dust. So if you were concerned about phthalates, banning phthalates from toys actually does extraordinarily little to help that. They were concerned about babies chewing on toys. They did studies on how much babies chew from toys and how much of these products could leach into small children, and found very, very little is the answer. So at best, this is something that would just placate people but wouldn't actually have any consequences. that would be the best case scenario if we think phthalates are bad for you. I personally think that some of the science on it is again, over-exaggerated, but there's been some recent work that I haven't had time to review entirely, which suggests that there is some concern for some of these things, but the worst phthalates, the people that NIH is most concerned on, is in fact not even put into toys. Okay, so I just want to give you a perspective on legislation now that is going into to banning them from toys. It is expensive for American industry, and unfortunately I think does very little to help a problem that may or may not exist. Another big political action that's based on science is No Child Left Behind. So what I want to make a couple comments about this because some people might disagree with me. The mandate of No Child Left Behind is to implement programs where you can scientifically prove that you're not leaving children behind. And that's the impetus behind why it is that there's so much testing that goes on to prove that your children are improving or to prove that you've left no child left behind. So there's this mandate for science to prove. And what that means is that you're going to look for cost-effective means to test people, test kids in their educational progress. And unfortunately, the data is really poor. And I'm going to actually talk about that a little bit later with a very specific example in math. So let me just leave that here. Another political action that's based on science, and I put it in quotations because it's bad science, is recommendations regarding alcohol consumption for pregnant and nursing women, which isn't to say that alcohol is not harmful for pregnant and nursing women. It's well established in large quantities that for pregnant women it is very harmful. So I'm not trying in any way to put this down, but if you look at small amounts of alcohol consumption and even fairly large amounts while nursing, the evidence is extremely poor. And in fact, I would go to such lengths as to say they have not found any evidence that it's actually bad for you to consume alcohol, small amounts of alcohol, small to moderate amounts of alcohol while pregnant, and even fairly large amounts while nursing. I think some of the most really alcoholic women while nursing they've been able to show that there's some problems. But I think that this, again, as someone who has ordered a drink while pregnant and being told all sorts of things, it's really annoying that people don't understand the research. So now let me move to mathematical challenges. And so this gets back to this No Child Left Behind. So there was some recent news about the National Science Foundation having published a study saying that girls have caught up in math. And this is really, really important because for many years, so for many years following, let me actually get to that in a moment. So this was based on No Child Left Behind data. So the history of why this became really exciting to the media was Larry Summers' remarks a few years ago, who was then the president of Harvard, commenting that women may lack as much intrinsic aptitude as men in science and math. And as a female mathematician, I didn't take it personally. I was actually at Harvard as an undergraduate, and I felt that what Summers missed was the tremendous influence of underlying assumptions about women and how negatively they affected young women who were interested in science. But in any case, without kind of addressing that, I actually spent some time to try to evaluate the validity of this remark back a few years ago. And so it was kind of exciting when National Science Foundation came out to show, in fact, they've caught up in math. But to say a few more words about Larry Summers, because I'm going to get back to the National Science Foundation and their report, and this gets back to the normal curve. Larry Summers actually was not saying that women on average are worse than men on average. Okay, so what he was talking about was how the variation compared, which is to say, boys, according to Summers' argument, would lie on this green curve, which is to say, and girls would be on the red curve. So that's to say their averages are the same, but boys had a lot more kids who are way out here doing great math than girls in terms of intrinsic ability, and also potentially did a lot worse than girls at the lower end. But what Summers' argument was, if you actually looked at it, which was not at all the way it was presented in the press. The way it was presented in the press was that boys were somehow just better than girls. And what I think most people would get from that is that on average they're better. But what he was in fact saying was that Harvard was interested in making hires out here, a few standard deviations from the mean. And because in fact he was talking, even worse, he was talking to a group of women engineers about the question of why Harvard didn't have any had so few faculty who were female in the sciences. So again, there weren't very many women to choose out far away from the mean. That was Summers' argument. So again, moving back to here, oh sorry, I wanted to, so moving back here, now we can see why it is that the recent news that girls have caught up really didn't take anything away from Summers' argument. I mean, it was kind of presented again in the press that, boy, now we showed Summers, in fact, girls have caught up. But let me even say a little bit more about that. Oh yeah, so I guess let me just finish this comment here, is that his comments were based on the idea that boys perform better than girls far from the mean on standardized tests such as SATs. So again, we're using SATs as a proxy for the ability to do great science, which is a fairly poor proxy. And then we're making a comment about the variation, not about the averages. So let me just say about the response of to that. Academics were outraged, and many of the people, especially women, but not only women, who are at Harvard and MIT nearby, felt, as I did, that Summers spoke from a history of sexism. And these kinds of comments echoed comments made about blacks in the past, also unfortunately at Harvard. And in fact, there was not a very strong correlation. You guys may remember the bell curve. This was a book that came out. Yeah, okay. So there wasn't a strong correlation between SAT performance and winning tenure at Harvard, okay? So, it's just a real stretch to sort of interpret something about SATs and come up with a statement about tenure at Harvard. What does it take to get tenure there? Incredible commitment, incredible luck, incredible ability to work with other people, incredible talent at science, maybe not incredible test-taking skills in a 3-hour period. Maybe not. Which isn't to say SATs don't tell you something. It's to say, what do they tell you? Not tenure at Harvard. What was the press response? Well, there were a lot of people who came out saying, look, free speech is dead. Can you believe all those academics who are upset at Summers' remarks? And that's academic freedom. He should be allowed to say what he wants. And I think they also wrote lots of different newspapers wrote a series of articles about what are the biological differences between men and women in the brain. They interviewed teachers at magnet science schools. What do you think about women in science? And they poked fun at themselves about not being able to balance their checkbook. That would be kind of like me poking fun that I can't actually make it through a novel. It's not really that funny, But and then the recent press response, which I mentioned earlier, declaring that the gap has closed between boys and girls following the NSF results, and that again is based on the idea that since the averages now have come out to be the same in No Child Left Behind data, that this should explain to us all that in fact women and men are equally good. Unfortunately, it's not quite true if you look far out in terms of who's continuing to do science and who's getting PhDs in science and math and who's getting jobs in these fields. So it's not really true. And I want to say a few more reasons about why this data, what this data actually says and what it doesn't say. So an interesting thing is that they found if they looked at the 99th percentile, so those are the kids who are really doing great, differences between girls and boys. In white kids, boys did better, and among Asians, girls did better, and unfortunately there wasn't enough data to make comparisons for the other groups. So what they also found is that, so this kind of thing where you see different races doing very well, of course these are demographic kind of information. They don't have every piece of information that you might want to know about these kids, but it does suggest that gender plays less of a role than socialization. That's also confirmed by international tests, in which there are some countries like Iceland in particular where girls far outperform boys. And then this was the very interesting thing, and I wanted to bring this up because I do think it's related to this issue of variation versus averages. So the NSF authors tried to code the questions on the test by the level of difficulty at 4 different levels. Level 1 was like recall mathematical facts. Level 2 would be skill or concept, the ability to carry out a mathematical process. Level 3 would be strategic thinking, which is something that is probably most important in advanced mathematical classes that I try to really get to in the courses that I teach at any level, and even with my young children. And like, how would you solve a problem? How would you try to solve a problem? And then level 4 is extended thinking, which is actually what you need to do to, for example, get a PhD in mathematics, to really put together a project. And of course, you would think that you couldn't have level 4 problems on a standardized test, but in fact they found so few questions even of level 3, they couldn't evaluate the differences between girls and boys even. There were that few questions. So what's happening, and again I wanted to connect this now to the issue that I mentioned before about is there actually any science in the politics? When it comes to something like No Child Left Behind, the desire to measure scientifically the outcome has meant that the tests become only in about level 1 and 2 questions. So in fact, we know virtually nothing about how our kids are doing in the most important thinking skills that will turn them into scientists. So what I would say is that the media are mistaking the data for something more difficult to measure. You can only conclude what the data can accurately measure. So what can we tell about behavior far from the mean on these tests? What does it take to do advanced mathematics? These are questions that aren't asked and in fact are not in the data. There is no way you can comb the data the right way and get it. Okay, so that's a sort of like, a lot of people have a lot of faith in data. If we only got the right interpretation, we would get it. No, it's actually not there. And I think that's really important. So again, let me just tell you what positive things happened from stats getting involved in this question, especially earlier on. I was actually on CNN International, which was really cool, with my sister, who was also a PhD in biostatistics, talking about how women actually can do math and science, and how difficult it is to predict who's going to be the next Einstein. We also talked about how SATs are not necessarily going to be predictive of success in the highest levels. Maybe a good performance or a decent performance is important, but so a really poor performance might indicate not being able to do it intellectually, but what is required to perform at the highest levels is so much more than what is measured on that test. Talked about the difficulty of extracting information far from the mean. Talked about what math education experts say on the issue, which, by the way, math education experts would never deny that there's a difference in performance between boys and girls, but what they would deny is that that has anything to do with inherent differences. And again, I think very few people are willing to say there are no differences. What they're willing to say is that any differences are hugely eclipsed by social factors and other reasons why it is that girls don't choose to do science. We talked about the question of academic freedom from an academic viewpoint. I think this is really important. The press had this whole thing, academic freedom is dead. And I think any academic would say you have to be able to support your view in a sound academic way. You can't just, I have some random idea based on a really superficial concept when there's there's a huge amount of research in a field. And that's what Summers really did, which is why what he said stunk of sexism and not of a difference of opinion. And I think that we gave the discussion a personal side to people's, and we made a difference in people's lives, I think. So now I actually want to move away from some of the things that were really personal for me and talk about predicting the presidency. Of course, now the presidency is over, maybe you guys find this a little bit less interesting than it would have been before, but I think it's actually really fun to think about how it is that all these pundits were out there trying to predict who was going to get elected to be president, McCain or Obama. And this is a kind of example of reporting on this that we saw a lot. There was one poll, the Mason-Dixon poll, that found that Obama was ahead of McCain in Virginia by 2 percentage points. So let's just assume it was 51 to 49. Unfortunately, there are also these undecideds. So I'm just going to assume it was 51 to 49. The margin of error was 4 percentage points. And what that means is that if you had 100 polls, 95 of them would find Obama's support somewhere between 47 and 55%. Okay? So a lot of reports claimed they were head-to-head, and others said that Obama is ahead. And it's kind of question like, what do we mean? What can we really interpret out of this? And one way to interpret it is that if they in fact were equally supported, there's only a 31% chance we'd see a poll like this. So there's not a whole lot of information, okay? But that's really the most accurate thing that you can say. So what problems do we see with polls? I mentioned already, a lot of people claim to be undecided in a poll, and that could be a problem. What if they're undecided because they actually think that the pollster really supports one of the two candidates? That happens a lot if you have a kind of generally viewed liberal. So say if the Washington Post calls you up and you're a McCain supporter, you may feel like, I don't want to talk to this guy, but I'll just say I'm undecided, when in fact you're really leaning towards McCain. All right, who are the likely voters? One of the things that happened with this particular presidency is that young people who had never voted before were really, really charged. Okay, so a lot of the traditional polling methods would say we're going to try to figure out who's a likely voter by saying who voted last election. Well, then you're going to keep everybody out who's under 22, and a lot of people who were so charged that they might have been 46, but it was the first time they were going to bother to vote, right? And again, that can happen on either side of the aisle. Who is polled? Again, this was another problem that really had to do with young people and people who are likely to move around more. They don't even have landlines anymore. And this was the first election where Gallup poll actually started actually sampling cell phone users and said that it was the first time that cell phone users could make a difference. Before, there's so few cell phone users, they can't make a difference, but they said this time they could. Margin of sampling error. I want to actually give you a story for this one. So I recently read in the press an article about a survey that was done of 250,000 doctors in the United States, and 49% of them planned to cut back or close their medical practice. And they cited a whole range of problems, from bureaucratic details that they didn't want to deal with anymore, Medicare not paying enough, and all sorts of things as to why they're very unhappy with the profession. Now, they even pointed out, I had a statistician on there, I don't know who gave this guy tenure, saying the margin of sampling error was 1%. Well, it turned out that their survey had a 4% response rate. Okay, so people who were close to retirement or who were very angry, they were probably much more likely to respond. And to talk about a sampling error, so what is a sampling error? A sampling error is, given a sample, how likely is this that it represents everybody? Now, if you do a poll of, say, presidents, most people actually do like to respond what their presidential choice is, and they're not so picky about who's asking them the question, as I was suggesting earlier. So the margin of sampling error is actually a calculation that's done entirely based on how many people respond to you. So if you see a lot of these articles in the news that say, the margin of error is plus or minus 3 percentage points, that's a calculation that's done based on how many people responded to the poll. But a different question is, however many that was, what percentage is that of the whole population that I tried to sample? Okay, and unfortunately in this case, that was a 4%, and that suggests a huge amount of bias, and talking about margin of sampling error is just inappropriate in this context.
You can't base it on the sample sizes, just the square root then?
That's right. It's just based on the square root. Exactly. So bias in the question itself. That can happen a lot. A lot of these polls, when people try to figure out what Americans think about abortion, for example, that's a great one where the way you ask the question really changes how those statistics come up. There's no uniform system for voting, so that affects who will vote, which votes count. That's a big one when it came to concerns that people had before the election, that there were certain places in the country where people were going to potentially have to wait for many, many hours to vote. Would they vote or would they not? And if this happened in predominantly poor areas where people predominantly supported Obama, would that affect the outcome? So that was a big concern. And are people truthful? Of course, you might, especially this happens a lot with exit polls. When you see these things, the exit poll didn't agree with what the outcome was, and there's a lot of suspicion then that there was some corruption in the outcome of the actual result based on exit polls, and maybe the exit poll people are actually lying to you because they don't want to talk to you. So let me talk about some other methods aside from polling that you might predict something like the presidency. Psychics, I saw a lot of them online talking about their methods, and the stock market was a good one. So that the stock market was somehow a model of dissatisfaction with Bush. Inflation rates and growth of the economy. Good news. Oh, the kids had a vote. Sorry, that just the carrot doesn't work. Vote by kids. In the school they have these scholastic votes. They've gotten the votes correct except for twice in the past 50 years. What divorced women feel. This was my favorite one. There was a big article about how divorced women were going to change were going to affect it. Social web data. So what's going on about internet queries? So how many queries are about Obama versus how many queries are about McCain? Polls, of course, you mentioned, pundits. And I want to tell you my favorite way of predicting anything, which is my magic coin. So I have this coin. It's really great. It tells me the presidency in any given election with a very simple rule. If it's heads, it's Republican. If it's tails, it's Democrat. You might not believe in my magic coin, but let me tell you, it's actually worked 15 out of the 17 past elections. It's a pretty good track record, right, for my magic coin. I bet you're impressed. If I just did that by chance, I would only have a 0.1% to do so well. That's like 1 in 1,000, right? All right, so pretty impressive coin. I hope you guys are impressed with my magic coin at this point. But let me tell you how I found it. Okay, because I didn't just find my magic coin by fishing in my pocket and doing this. I did the following thing. I got together 1,000 of my best friends, and I had them flip the coin 17 times. Okay? And the first time they write down heads, the next, if it's a heads, tails, they write down 17, and then I matched it up with the presidents of the past 17 elections, and I chose the best one. Right? It's the best coin. That's the magic coin. That's where I got it. So it turns out I had about a 70% chance of finding someone who got it all right among those 1,000 people who flipped that coin 17 times. So it's not surprising now that I have a magic coin, but you might still be suspicious as to whether it will work next time. Right? Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But then there's this question, what does that actually say about regression analysis? So what's the idea of regression analysis? It's that we look at past behavior and we try to find a statistical model that models it well, that predicts well past behavior. And then we say, this is going to be a really good predictor of future behavior. Now, unlike a coin, you usually put variables in your regression analysis that you have reason to believe will be related to the outcome. So, for example, I was reading a story about some regression analysis done on Bordeaux wines. And this guy got together a model in which he predicted how good the Bordeaux wines would be based on how dry the climate was, what the rainfall was, and other things that in fact do impact quality of wine. And then, and of course, all the wine experts were very dismissive, saying you couldn't possibly do what we do with a regression analysis. And in fact, he predicted better the following year what the Bordeaux wines would be like than the experts had. The experts do it based on tasting things from barrels early in the aging process. Okay. But I do think that we give quite a lot of weight to regression models when unfortunately, there is this element, which is, well, did they just get lucky? Did they just choose the best model out of many models that they chose that modeled the previous data the best? Is it like my magic coin, or is it actually something that tells us something about the future? So I just want to give you another example of some statistical topics that have come up in the press. This is about sensitivity versus specificity. Now, a lot of people don't know what these are, so I actually really want to take you through this example. And this is a story about lie detectors that came up in the Washington Post. And this is a kind of a classic example in using probability in a way that's against our intuition, let's say that. So 10,000 people take a lie detector test, and let's assume 10 of them are spies, and 9,990 of them are not spies, or honest people. And it turns out that the research suggests that just under 1,600 people would fail the test, meaning that they would be shown to be lying, including 8 of the spies would be shown to be lying, and the other 2 spies would have passed, and the remaining people who weren't spies also would have passed. So let's just do the calculation here. So out of the 990 innocent people, 9,990 innocent people, 1,592 of them failed the test. And they're what we call false positives. They're people who tested positive for lying when they weren't. They weren't lying. They were telling the truth. And we calculate the percents at 16%, and that's what we call sensitivity is 100 minus that. So sensitivity is 84% sensitive. On the other hand, 8 of the 10 liars failed the test, and that gives us what we call specificity of 80%. So if you think about that, it sounds pretty good. 84 and 80 are pretty high numbers. But just because a lot of the spies are actually so infrequent in the population, you actually get the percentage of the spies in the pool of people who failed that test, okay? Who failed the test? Now we look for the spies. 8 out of 1,600 people. That's 0.5%. So in other words, it's really hard to find the spies. Okay, and even though 80%, 84% sounds like, if you ask people how much do you think, how likely is it do you think that they'll get the spy there by looking in the pool of people who failed the test, who looked like they were lying, I think a lot of people would say, well, maybe 75%. But in fact, it's 0.5%, so really small. All right, so now let me just say a couple more words about what we do. So we write op-eds. We speak on a lot of radio shows. We write letters to the editor, occasionally get published. We interview for television programs on their topics of interest. And we do ourselves some in-depth data-driven journalism that we hope serves as a model for a lot of journalists. We advise journalists. I'll spend a couple hours on the phone with somebody about their data questions. Sometimes they'll send me Excel charts, ask me questions about that. We've run some workshops. We provide an FAQ on our website, which has actually been picked up by the Annenberg School of Journalism. We run a website with some materials and a blog. We have occasionally testified to Congress about specific issues. We've done some polls on experts, like we've done some polls, for example, what do climatologists think about global warming, as opposed to what do journalists think about global warming, right? Okay, so kind of a different point of view. Again, I want to emphasize this point about really looking to the consensus of the scientific consensus as a means of what should be reported to the public, at least as the scientific consensus. If you want to say you're writing an article and you want to say what the fringe points of view are, or the slightly different points of view, maybe report both and talk about why that isn't accepted in the mainstream consensus yet. We also put out what's called dubious data awards. These are always a lot of fun. Every year we sort of take the studies that are the most. This year, this past just a couple weeks ago, we came up with the following. So we've got baby bottle baloney, which is when people all threw away their plastic bottles and bought glass ones based on fears of chemicals leaching out from the baby bottles that would cause obesity, among other things. It turned out that the lead scientist who's been touting this point of view has been dismissed by independent risk analyses in Europe. Treats, shoots, and misses. This is a study that was reported on in the New York Times, which suggested that U.S. healthcare is really dismal compared to other countries, and it turned out that a lot of the ways in which they came to this conclusion was based on patient satisfaction. So if Americans like to complain more than Europeans, then our healthcare is worse, rather than outcome measurements such as, what's the likelihood of living if you had a heart attack or something like that. I mentioned to you also about the CNN reporting on kids getting cancer from hot dogs. Another cute one was rainfall and autism, that increases in rainfall cause autism. And there they had done some study in the Seattle area and found this correlation, but it turned out that the correlation was very indirect. They had to come up with new measurements. They didn't find actually a direct link, but it was still reported on by USA Today. Toxic shower curtain smell. This is one that was reported in Los Angeles Times. They had done one last year on toxic new car smell. But again, this is the idea. So this is related to phthalates, which I mentioned earlier, that they were actually being emitted by shower curtains, and we were, getting death in the shower stall, like in the movie Psycho. But actually, it turns out that the level of measurements of what was being emitted from the curtains was below the detection level. So it was just the phthalates were in the curtains, but they actually didn't have any evidence of them being emitted from the curtains and giving us exposure while showering. Acupuncture and fertility. This one we got a lot of news agencies reported about the benefits of using acupuncture to improve fertility for women who were having trouble conceiving. It turns out that they actually confused something called the odds ratio with relative risk, and it turned out in this case that the benefits were much, much smaller than reported. And in fact, the lead author of the study was an acupuncturist. Again, latent sexism. Boston Globe reported that the latest research on the lack of women in science was because women were embracing the freedom to say no. So saying no to careers in science was the reason that women were not in science, not anything else. And that was, again, as I mentioned earlier, contrary to what most research by education professors have found with regard to why women are not staying in fields of science. But also it turns out that they didn't count biology. Okay. So
they decided biology wasn't really a science.
Biology was not really a science, and I think that's because 60% of the degrees went to women, so it no longer counted. I mentioned the survey with margin of error. Another cute one was New York Times reporting 1 million people live inside Dublin's official borders, which are such that you can literally walk anywhere in about half an hour. So we did a model to assume the city was circular shaped and it had a diameter of approximately 2 miles, so that was about that was what they were essentially saying, and it turned out it would be therefore about 5 times more densely inhabited than Manhattan. It turns out that they misrepresented the size of Dublin by order of magnitude of about 12, and they also doubled the population. Another one was giving the finger to pixie dust, we called it. So apparently some guy had chopped off his finger and claimed that he had fixed it and it had regenerated it by sprinkling pixie dust on it. And he had all these surgeons reporting on it. This was all over the press. But it turned out he actually only lost a piece of flesh, and it turned out also that those do regenerate. In case any of you should have a child like mine, you'd be happy to know this. So, it's some mix of some weird proteins that come from a pig, actually. I'm not exactly sure of what it's made of, but I'm sure that you can buy some. All right, so I finally wanted to finish up with a small video of kind of the real reason, which I hope came through in this lecture, to why I do this. I really like to live not in fear, but in knowledge, and I have a movie to suggest that. The movie's actually in French, but it has subtitles, and I'll finish with that.
Au Japon, on consomme peu de graisse et le nombre d'infarctus y est plus faible qu'aux États-Unis. En France, on consomme beaucoup de graisse et le nombre d'infarctus y est plus faible qu'aux États-Unis. En Inde, on boit peu de vin rouge et le nombre d'infarctus y est plus faible qu'aux États-Unis. En Espagne, on boit beaucoup de vin rouge et le nombre d'infarctus y est plus faible qu'aux États-Unis. Au Brésil, on fait beaucoup plus l'amour qu'en Algérie et le nombre d'infarctus des deux pays est plus faible qu'aux États-Unis. Conclusion, buvez, mangez, faites l'amour autant que vous voulez. Ce qui peut tuer, c'est de parler anglais.
The case of the rainfall and autism, you said there was just indirect correlation.
Yeah, so what they did, this is kind of a somewhat common thing, and I don't really know how it's evaluated by the statistical community when people do this, but what they did was they didn't find a direct relationship with rainfall amount, so they made some index up, which they seemed to be, if I understood correctly, what the index was some deviation from the mean in the counties that were being considered, which were some number of counties in the Seattle area. So they did find some Yes, yes. But the way that they described their calculation didn't entirely make sense to me, but they invented some kind of index. And the worry that I have as a critical reader of that is, first of all, why wasn't it directly correlated to rainfall, and why didn't the authors admit that they tried it and it didn't work? Because that's kind of the obvious thing to do, right? And then the second thing is, how many other different kinds of indices did they try before they found one that did work? And again, this is a question of multiple testing. And it's really important. If you run a lot of statistical tests and you fail to find significance, and then you sort of change around things, and then you run the tests again, and now we see a correlation, usually as you do more multiple tests, at least if they're independent tests, what you would do is you would increase your standard for what significance means. So when they say that the p-value is less than 0.05, you would decrease that. So you need to have a stronger result for me to believe you, because there's more chance that you got lucky because you tried a few things. Okay, so this is an issue of what's called multiple testing, and so when I see something like that, I feel very suspicious. Although it's possible that this weird index would work, I think that it would be much more powerful if these people who said, okay, now I found a new index that worked, then moved to a different data set and showed that index still worked. That would be a much more convincing kind of argument, but they didn't do that. But it was still reported as rainfall causing autism. So
these were whether biomedical research was reproducible.
Oh, yes.
And they found sort of dismal results on the reproducibility of, including very large epidemiological studies and clinical trials. And I'm wondering, are you familiar with that?
I heard about it, but I didn't read it directly, so I only heard about it kind of hearsay. But it doesn't surprise me, because there's a tremendous amount of bias also in what gets published. So, I mean, a negative result. So let me just put it this way. Even without putting the journal's bias into it, like what does a journal want to publish in terms of positive results versus negative results? Let's take that out of the equation and just ask about, say, how pharmaceutical research is carried out. Usually pharmaceutical research is funded by the pharmacy company that would benefit if it gets approved. And if the clinical trials go really well, of course those results are published, because that's going to add to the product. If the results come out negative, there's no financial incentive, in fact, for them to publish it. So even without suggesting that they wouldn't want to publish it because it would make their company look bad, they simply wouldn't bother to put their resources in to say, oh, such and such didn't work. So there's a tremendous amount of bias in what gets published, in my opinion, right from the structure itself of how we fund research, to also then what do editors look for. I mean, if you don't find a correlation, it's not nearly as interesting as if you do. So there's that element. So it doesn't surprise me. And then, what counts as a correlation typically means that you're 95% confident, which means that there's some large number of times, as much as 1 in 20, you're getting a result that wouldn't be reproducible. So 1 in 20 is already pretty high, right? So.
Well, no, but the reports I was reading suggest that the numbers for non-reproducibility were much higher, like a third.
Yeah, I mean, given the process, I'm not super surprised, but I haven't actually read that research directly. Sorry.
Just related to that, and oftentimes we hear about the gene for and it makes a big splash, but then follow-up studies don't support that. But those don't make a splash at all.
Right. That's a really big issue, is sort of talking about only one side of it. And that happens a lot in the press. Sorry, he's been holding up his hand for a while.
A question about secondhand smoke, because I was once at a meeting in Oxford and I said something to a British guy that was there, and he almost knocked me out for saying that it was terrible to be exposed to secondhand smoke. But recently the CDC seems to be confirming that. And there's someone who comes from other parts of here at the NSF temporarily. I'm surprised that you can't walk into a building without someone blowing smoke in this building, the National Science Foundation. So have you looked at this problem?
Very briefly, just as a little history, the previous guy who had my job ended up leaving the job to go head up he's like the drug czar for the Bush administration. And he did some work on secondhand smoke, which I did not think very highly of, in which he cited some organizations who claim that secondhand smoke is not dangerous for you. And at that point, when I was considering coming onto the job, I really wanted to know how good that research was, and I did some work on it. So this is probably like 4 or 5 years ago. So I don't know, I haven't looked at it since then, but what I found at the time is that there's fairly convincing evidence that secondhand smoke is bad for children. Like, pretty much it's established. The question of how much, and it's also fairly well established that people, say, who work in bars and are exposed to smoke all the time also do have some effects. But they've been very little evidence that if your coworker smokes and you happen to be there sometime and they're not, like, say, smoking like a chimney all the time, that you'll necessarily have increased risks of cancer. So I would say that there's not super strong evidence about secondhand smoke among adults in a work environment, but there's fairly convincing evidence at other places, and I think sort of the comment of whether it should be allowed or not allowed in public buildings, I guess, is a big public discussion. I think it annoys a lot of people, right? So, yeah. Sorry.
A lot of your stuff, you look like you're dealing with stuff in kind of a reactive mode to the press, sort of responding to the pressure of, let's put the headline out there that gets the attention. And so they try to sell this with trying to make something really spectacular to really get your attention. But so you've responded to it. Looks like you've responded a lot to that. But it sounds like you provide a resource that hopefully can be used in a more proactive method. And are you finding that you're being called upon, and does that actually impact stories and stuff like that?
It's a very good question. When the organization was originally founded, which is before my time, it was definitely set up as a kind of a gotcha organization, and the goal was definitely to point out faulty science that had been reported in the media and then get it into congressional record and make effects on legislation. And so we continue to do that kind of work, and that's the kind of work that makes most fun for a talk. To be very honest, right? Like, would it be interesting? I said, I got a call from BBC yesterday and we talked about odds ratio. I mean, it's not nearly as interesting as kind of giving you the stories. So we do hope to be a resource to journalists, and I do get some number of calls on it. It's very hard to know whether we've influenced positively their work or not, because the calls can range from anything like, hey, I'm looking for the statistics on how many people a year get struck by lightning, which we're like, that's not what we do. We don't actually do your research for you. To I'm in a fight with my editor about whether to include this number that's really bogus or not. And so that's also, I'm like, it's like I'm being a support as a sort of perspective on things, but I can't, it's not really mathematical in nature. To someone who sends me an Excel chart with data and says, how would you interpret these data about whether blacks are getting put into prison more than whites in such and such county, okay? And so on that kind of thing, I find that last work very interesting. But it's also, it's a little bit difficult. Sometimes I've had, say, government employees who call me to ask me about that for a report they're writing for work. And I'm thinking, this isn't my job, right? But you don't want to necessarily get on someone's bad side either. So there's kind of, I've had that kind of go, but really what we like to do is that thing I was saying, if somebody says, I'm really trying to figure out, I've seen some difference in SAT scores, what does that mean? This one I mentioned about races associated with convictions, on jury selection and things like that. It was a very interesting case. And sometimes they'll be just like, I'm trying to write a subtitle to my graph, and I don't know what the right thing to say is of what my graph really represents. And so you'll get a whole, so we do serve as a resource. We'd like to do it more. We have run workshops. It's very hard to be proactive because you don't know how, you can't, I'm just going to call up the New York Times and say, I'm here, right? So you have to find a way to do that. And I think probably our website could be greatly improved in sort of communicating that message that we're there to people. But yeah.
I'd just like you to keep going and advance a little bit more about all the ways that statisticians and perhaps other scientists can help the media. One thing that is curious to me is whether or not we can help, say, journalism schools to include more of that in the curriculum, more ways to think skeptically or to be a little more sensible about statistics and numbers and understand these kinds of things. It's not a natural fit, I don't think.
Well, so some journalism schools have classes in statistics, so it's not that it doesn't exist or hasn't been thought of, but you're correct to say it's very difficult to change what curriculum they're already doing, or to give them a sense that it would be really important. I think that a lot of journalists come to realize that it's important a little bit later in their careers, when they realize how unable they are to report on something because they really need some quantitative skills. And so I personally actually think we'd be doing much better to target kind of mid-career people, because a lot of times you get someone who's an anthropology major who does kind of the local beat and then suddenly gets put on the science journalism, put as head of the science unit, and then they're doing science journalism, and they don't have any sense even of what the scientific method is. And then you have to kind of get past the idea that they might think that they kind of do. And so there's it's difficult to make that. It's very difficult to make that connection. But as to your question of what can you do, I think as a statistician or somebody who's scientifically oriented, one thing that's really important is alerting them to resources that are available. So a lot of journalists nowadays do almost all their research online. They're very reluctant to even pick up a phone, and a lot of it's very specialized. So for example, if I write a piece here about a particular media a particular piece of current news, I'll get more calls than if I write something that's let's talk about the difference between causation and correlation. The abstract thing is not what will appeal to them, it's the case study that appeals to them. So it makes it difficult for someone who's very good at the abstract part, who's thinking in terms of the general principles, to actually get them to be interested to talk to you. That is a real challenge. So I think that one way you could do it is to write letters to the editor, and even in your letter, you can also talk about websites in which certain kinds of information is available. Even if they don't publish your letter, they're reading it, and the editor is reading it. So that's actually a really important sort of task towards doing it. But fund us. I think these are the kinds of organizations that are really out there saying, we are your resource to journalists. Sorry.
You mentioned the definition of statistical significance at one point. If you were presented with a result of an analysis and the mean of some variable was specified, say, as 5, and the standard deviation was specified as, say, 50, would you say that 5 was significantly statistically significant and different from 0?
I think it's hard for me to answer that question out of context, but the way you're describing it, I mean, it sounds like you're trying to make some measurement that 50 wouldn't make sense or something, but the way you're describing it, I would say that it's probably not really different. But I do hear what you're saying, and it would depend on what, I'd have to actually look at the specific context.
I was at a briefing once by somebody from EPA who's describing the result of some epidemiological study that was used to promote rulemaking, and the data really looked very poor in terms of the uncertainty related to the sort of to the health impact that was being measured. And what struck me was that as soon as you announce a negative result to the public about a certain causal thing, you create stress. And stress, we know, is debilitating, and stress, we know, has physical effects on people and populations. And I couldn't help wondering whether, since there seemed to be so little statistical strength in the study, whether they were doing more harm by announcing this potential health impact because of the stress that they were creating in populations than they were helping people.
Right.
And I questioned him about it, and he said, no, that wouldn't be true, because 5 is the correct number. Even though it did not seem to me.
Right. I mean, if the confidence interval is including 0, so I'm trying to understand what the context is that 0 meant no effect. Is that right?
Right.
So then, yeah, I mean, if 0 is in the confidence interval, then yeah, he's not. It's not a fair evaluation. Yeah.
You know, they want to be conservative, but they potentially cause problems.
Yeah. No, it's true. Yeah.
Your discussion mentioned recall bias in cancer victims. They said they ate a hot dog every day, that caused their cancer. How do we know that recall bias exists?
Oh, that's a good question. Actually, I don't know the research on that. I've just read, in fact, that it is the case. I actually can't answer your question. But I guess some people have done some studies on behavioral things for which they had some other measurements, maybe based on what spouses say that they do. But it's kind of a known thing that people, I mean, I think that the suspicion is that it comes from some weird sense of guilt or something. You know, I got cancer because I harmed myself. And, you know, it's certainly a lot of things that we get cancer for are things that we do to ourselves. But apparently recall bias is a serious concern when it comes to studies like that.
I wonder if it has something to do with some bias in the question or just specific outcome.
Could be. I mean, I think that the questions are like, how often did you do this? How often did you do that? Yeah. So, I mean, it's another one like, so, you know, if you tried to evaluate people who had, to give you an example, if you had women who had children with the alcohol syndrome, and you said, you know, how much did you drink, they would probably augment how much they in fact drank. So it's a really bad way to do research. Yeah.
I was responsible for trying to design a few little surveys, and boy, was I naive when I started. Food and Drugs Administration in the foods part about food safety. And you take a strange person, and you send them up to somebody's door, and then you ask them if they've had certain types of illnesses that they have been taught to associate with very bad mothering or very bad, filthy housekeeping. You ask them if they've had that illness, and you get a lot of, no, we haven't. And then you check at what you really can see with the kids' absences and the real stuff that's happening with young children and all of diarrheal disease, which is considered embarrassing and very personal to a lot of people. And unfortunately, a lot of our agencies were taking the data as read. It was very, very strange. And we had to get in and overcome that.
Wow.
Because the willingness to talk to a stranger on your doorstep who might then join your club or your church or your social set in the next week and say, yeah, I have a filthy kitchen and I get food poisoning with my children all the time. This is a real psychological problem too.
Absolutely.
So there's all kinds of human survey data.
Yeah.
We made a lot of good advances. It was very tough.
Repeat the question.
There wasn't a question there. He was pointing out that the difficulty in doing surveys if people are invested in the answer being one way or the other. So if you survey somebody by going to their house and asking them something for which they may feel guilt or shame about, they'll tend to lie about it, especially because they think they might join your club or your church, right? So these are people who you might know in another context. Now they know all this personal information about you, so you tend to, you know, make the picture look rosier. Yeah.
My favorite example of that is they did a study where they asked people what their consumption of milk and alcohol was. And then they looked at their garbage. And as you might expect, they overstated their consumption of milk and understated their alcohol.
Anyway, thanks again.